Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Orphic Astrology channel. My name is Natalia Alas. Before we get into the astrology for the month of October, I'd like to briefly recap the events that unfolded under the astrological transits of September. One of the most challenging months, if not the most challenging of 2025, September's sky weather contained the final pair of eclipses, which were bookended by heavy-hitting transits of the infortunes. Last month began with Saturn's regress back into Pisces and Mercury's ingress of Virgo. Uranus stationed retrograde for the first time since ingressing Gemini, and Mars squared Jupiter the first week of September. We also saw the heliacal rising of Regulus, the heart of the lion, that first week of September, and Alphard, the heart of Hydra, throughout the month across different locations. Saturn back in Pisces brought news of the Sumud flotilla setting sail for Gaza, and the Mars-Jupiter square leading up to the lunar eclipse in Pisces reflected political corruption around the world, catalyzing a number of global uprisings, most notably in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Nepal. In the United States, President Trump announced the rebranding of the Department of Defense to the Department of War on the day of Uranus' station and heliacal rising of Regulus, immediately following the Mars-Jupiter square. The ominous nature of Regulus's morning rise coinciding with the Uranus retrograde station and the Mars-Jupiter square that week also foretells difficult months ahead for nations and their leaders, which therefore signals challenges for the people as unrest and resistance persist against increasingly fascist regimes. As I mentioned in September, Saturn's regress back into Pisces is now answering to an exalted Jupiter and by trine instead of to an exiled Jupiter and by square, as we saw last year. Abu Mashar qualified the trine between Saturn and Jupiter to indicate, among other things, an increase in the presence of propagandists. And as soon as Saturn re-entered Pisces, we saw headlines pertaining to exactly this. News outlets published that Google had signed a $45 million contract with the Israeli Prime Minister's office to run a global digital advertising campaign promoting Israeli state messaging during its ongoing genocide in Gaza. Telesur wrote that, quote, "This contract marks one of the most expensive and systematic uses of digital advertising by a state to influence global public opinion during an active war," end quote, exposing how tech giants are shaping narratives through digital warfare, where algorithms, data, and advertising are used as weapons. In September, Russia also launched a propaganda drive to mask its economic weakness. So I expect more reports exposing propaganda schemes to increase in October 2025 as Jupiter and Saturn perfect their trine, now joined by Mars to configure the Grand Water Trine near the end of the month and into November. More on that later. So this past eclipse season was exceptionally volatile, as we saw in world events, mainly due to the influence of the malefics. Saturn's influence marked both lunations, with the lunar eclipse being co-present the greater infortune, and the solar eclipse being directly opposite Saturn. Furthermore, the lunar eclipse in Pisces was answering to an exalted Jupiter squaring off with an exiled Mars, exacerbating the lunar eclipse's unhinged nature. In the fallout of the lunar eclipse in Pisces, we saw the public execution of Charlie Kirk, a prominent white supremacist in the United States. This was an assassination committed by another white supremacist supremacists, yet somehow initially blamed on leftist, trans people, and people of color, which caused a ripple effect of political violence against Black and trans individuals in the States, as well as a number of people both in the public and private sectors of society becoming unemployed for not publicly mourning the murder of Charlie Kirk and for criticizing or ridiculing the president and the government's reactions. Mercury in the sign of its exaltation, but also passing along the path of the South Node and culminating its transit by an opposition to Saturn, saw widespread censorship and infringement on freedom of speech for those criticizing the state's eulogizing of Charlie Kirk, a figure who had in fact spent his life advocating white supremacist patriarchal agendas. He was made a martyr by conservatives and liberals alike, and especially religious zealots. A lot of crazy shit went down in the United States because of this, and Kirk's assassination ended up overshadowing some of the more horrific events of genocide, mass shootings, lynchings, and ICE kidnappings that occurred prior to and in its wake, not to mention the obfuscation of the Epstein files. Then, at the end of September, as predicted on Threads, the IOF attacked the global Sumud flotilla en route to Gaza as Mars applied a square to Pluto retrograde. This drone attack arrived on the heels of the solar eclipse that occurred at the anaretic degree of Virgo, during which 3 of the 5 eyes nations, the UK, Canada, and Australia, finally recognized the state of Palestine. The recognition of Palestine by these countries was a major blow to the Zionist entity and therefore began raising concerns about Israel's retaliation against Palestinians and their allies. The fact that they announced their recognition while the moon was conjunct the South Node further brings into question the stability of their words, and it's possible that later down the line, these same countries will backtrack. Another thing I mentioned in my September video forecast for Mars's ingress of Scorpio and its square to Pluto retrograde in Aquarius was that this configuration historically indicates heightened violence and political power struggles, but it could also show up as the courage to defend, as Mars is not just the warring general, but can also represent the defender and protector of the more vulnerable. So I was wondering if there would be some sort of military intervention, and we saw this with the announcement that Italy and Spain would send their naval fleets to guard the flotilla in response to the attacks against it, and the general strike by the people of Italy in support of Palestine. However, Italy and Spain backed away at the last minute as Israel threatened to intercept the flotilla, which coincided with Mars separating from the square to Pluto and losing its conviction. So these are just some of the key world events that stood out to me, and I'm sure I missed some, so please let me know in the comments what stood out to you in September with regards to the astrology. Now, let's take a look at the astrology of the month ahead. October 2025 starts off with Mercury squaring Jupiter on the 1st and Venus conjoining the South Node on the 4th. The following Monday, on the 6th/7th, we have the full moon in Aries and Mercury's ingress of Scorpio on the same day. With Mercury's ingress, our divine messenger begins to apply to Mars in Scorpio. Venus sextiles Jupiter on the 8th, followed by Venus opposition Saturn on the 11th. Then Venus ingresses her Aries domicile on the 13th, the same day that Pluto stations direct with the last quarter moon in Cancer. Venus in Libra will trine Pluto in Aquarius on the 15th. The Sun squares Jupiter on the 17th, a few days before Mercury finally catches up with Mars on the 20th. We then have the new moon in Libra with Mercury entering its shadow on the 21st, and the sun enters Scorpio on the 22nd, the same day that Neptune retrogrades back into Pisces. October ends with Mercury ingressing Sagittarius immediately in opposition to Uranus retrograde on the 29th. In my calendar, I also include the dates for the Hellenic monthly hearth ceremonies, beginning with the Hekatea on the evening of the dark moon / new moon, when devotees make offerings to Hecate at the neighborhood crossroads and family thresholds. This is followed by the traditional Numenia on the evening of the first waxing crescent light, when we make offerings to the elevated ancestors and hearth deities. On the third day from the dark moon, offerings are made to the Agathodaimon or Agathodaimones. And then on the fourth day, sacred to Aphrodite, offerings are made to her. October also sees the heliacal rise of Arcturus and Spica, and Alphecca begins to appear in some locations along the 45-degree north latitude. We will talk about these heliacal rising stars in my monthly live chat on Patreon, so if this interests you, I encourage you to become a member for as little as $5 a month. This month portends some challenging circumstances around media and communications, markets and banks, embassies and legal advisors, labor contracts and unions, children and youth, and possibly sports and sports figures, but also war strategizing, espionage, thievery, and deception, with Mercury's transit first squaring Jupiter and then later conjoining Mars before entering the sign of its exile and retrograde shadow. Venus in the sign of her fall, conjunct the South Node early in the month, can signify frugality as a consequence to a major loss or expenditures, or it may reflect an assault on women and historically excluded members of society that leads to further exclusionary social practices. On a personal level, it can also represent a reorientation or release of relationships that are either hindering or in need of right alignment. It can represent a sensitivity towards loss in relationships, or an awareness to the loss of women's rights, or attention to toxic habits or karmic patterns in relationship to others, to finances, or to the feminine. Our first lunation of the month then occurs on the 6th/7th, depending on your location, at 14 degrees tropical Aries or 21 degrees sidereal Pisces in Hrevati Nakshatra. This lunation coincides with the 2-year anniversary of Al-Aqsa flood and the start of this current chapter of the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Obviously, there are serious mundane implications with this full moon on a number of levels. Since antiquity, the sign of Aries has been assigned to Palestine. This lunation in Aries is answering to Mars in Scorpio, who is applying to the Grand Water Trine with Jupiter in Cancer, and Saturn retrograde in Pisces. These 3 planets will align to perfect their Grand Water Trine around 25 degrees. And as I mentioned on Threads last month, what's interesting is that 25 degrees is the degree that Mars made its previous cazimi, or solar conjunction, in Scorpio back on the 18th of November in 2023, which marked the inception of the current Mars synodic cycle and the first attempt at a ceasefire in Gaza. When Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn align, they mark important world events. Since the days of Mashallah and Abu Mashar, these planets have been observed to chronicle shifts in epochs with the rise and fall of empires, dynasties, and religions through their associations with colonization, war, and uprisings. Furthermore, their transits are intricately reflected in the history of the occupation of Palestine. So I've been anticipating this Mars transit, knowing it will be forming this Grand Water Trine with Jupiter and Saturn as it returns to the degree that began the current Mars synodic cycle. That's coming to a close with the Mars cazimi in Capricorn in early January 2026. I will have to do another breakdown of the Mars cycle along with its planetary aspects involving Jupiter and Saturn because there's a lot to unpack with that. So I won't get into that in this video. But I do foresee pivotal events around military action taking place in the days of the waxing gibbous phase leading up to and through the full moon in Aries. This full moon is applying a square to Jupiter, and in the days following, as it begins to wane gibbous in Taurus, Luna will oppose Mercury and then Mars in Scorpio. So this lunation may also reflect other militaristic endeavors globally, including espionage and the US military activity in the Caribbean and Venezuela, on top of the militarization of US cities or other violence involving a corruption of justice or infringement of people's rights. The waning lunar opposition to Mars may further represent a call to organize protest or people's strike in response to injustice and political violence. This is the first lunation in Aries that is not an eclipse since 2022. Happening in the last quarter of the year that marks the first quarter of the 21st century is also significant, as we have seen how this year's lunations have galvanized people's movements around the world as end-stage capitalism collapses by its last grasps at maintaining power. Aries is also the sign of forceful rebellion and reformation, initiation, and vernal rites of passage as the first cardinal or pivoting sign of the zodiac. In many ways, this full moon is a rite of passage, testing our courage in the face of fear. It arrives as the sun descends into the darkest time of the year in the northern hemisphere, bringing light to the cooling nights and seasonal anxieties pertaining to our survival. The Aries/Libra axis in lunations can also mirror back our fight or flight responses. Fight represented by Aries and flight represented by Libra. Our future as humanity is being challenged. Fortunately, and yet against all odds, many are rising to the occasion while others may still be frozen or in disbelief. We must remember that our strength is rooted in our compassionate solidarity with one another, and that we can only survive in relationship with others. This full moon brings a reminder that we actually do depend on one another, and we can only shine as individuals when our communities are secured. Following the full moon, when the waning gibbous moon is in Taurus and opposite Mercury in Scorpio, Venus in Virgo sextiles Jupiter in Cancer on the 8th, offering a bit of a reprieve before Venus later opposes Saturn retrograde on the 11th. Topics around women's rights, including trans rights, may be highlighted by Venus in Virgo, as the sign of her fall can represent historically excluded individuals, and in opposition to Saturn retrograde, there can be an indication of a sort of impediment or blockage or an archaic opponent against trans women and women of color in particular. Venus enters her Aries domicile on the 13th, the same day that Pluto stations direct in Aquarius, forming a trine to the Lord of the Underworld on the 15th. Power plays have the potential to shift from struggle to resolution at this time. The trine between Venus and Pluto may signify a form of cooperation between those in positions of power and those in historically subjugated roles, or it can represent a cunningly creative or bold confrontation to oppressive forces, since the moon will also be in Leo, opposing Pluto through its trine with Venus. Then the sun squares Jupiter on the 17th as the moon passes through Virgo and the dragon's lair of the south node. Sun square Jupiter can represent excessive or even egotistical behavior, as the dominating luminary, often depicted as the all-seeing god or king, makes a harsh aspect with the king of the sky gods. Jupiter is also associated with laws and political ties or powerful alliances, stewardships, abundance, and freedom, as well as the culminations in perfection for things which are preliminary and initiatory in world events. The square to the sun is an important moment in Jupiter's synodic cycle before it stations retrograde. Jupiter will station retrograde at 25 degrees Cancer next month, trine Saturn at 25 degrees Pisces, right before Saturn stations direct. Then the next major solar aspect Jupiter makes will be its opposition to the Sun in January 2026, marking the midway point of its orbit around the Sun and appearing its brightest in the night sky. Jupiter's solar opposition will coincide with the Mars and Venus cazemis in Capricorn. So events occurring with this Jupiter-Sun square may be tied to the Jupiter opposition and Mars and Venus cazemis early next year. We'll talk more about these important transits in a later video. Then Mercury catches up with Mars in Scorpio on the 20th. The Mercury Mars conjunction in Scorpio is probably the highlight and most difficult transit of the month, as it reflects sharp-tongued discourse, or rather argumentative and even combative exchanges. Luckily, the day of their partile conjunction, the balsamic moon will be conjunct Venus in Libra. But this configuration will be building up through most of October, so intense events may be reflected in the days leading up to their exact conjunction. Mercury in Scorpio is associated with intense, depthful, insightful observations, sleuthing and soothsaying, delving into the deepest reaches of the mind, and getting to the heart of matters. It is the opposite of superficial conversation and small talk. Conjunct Mars, Mercury supports both planets' more scheming qualities, so this transit may signify some undercover plotting, espionage, and war strategizing. Caution is advised against engaging in online debates or getting into it with your rivals or even friends this month, as this configuration can bring with it regret. Remember to pick your battles wisely. Since it will peak on the moon's day as Luna embraces Venus, I would remediate with leaning into lunar or Venusian devotional practices. The new moon then takes place at 28 degrees tropical Libra or 5 degrees sidereal Libra in Chitra Nakshatra on the 21st, right before the sun's ingress of Scorpio on the 22nd. The Libra new moon will be in opposition to Chiron retrograde at 24 degrees Aries and in a T-square with Jupiter at 24 degrees Cancer. Conjunct Spica at 24 degrees Libra, this lunation calls to mind the intimate relationship between Hecate and Persephone, how Hecate illuminated Persephone's whereabouts to her mother Demeter and then became Persephone's closest companion in the underworld. Spica is traditionally associated with Persephone and innocence and is referred to as the unarmed one. So the new moon in Libra may bring attention to the innocent or most vulnerable in our communities, and especially to the children of the world suffering under abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and war. On the new moon, Mercury still conjunct Mars also reaches the degree that it will station direct in at 20 degrees Scorpio, thus entering its pre-retrograde shadow and activating its chthonic and psychopompic role. So with chthonic Hermes preparing our katabasis, the new moon conjuncts Spica with Venus co-presence and configured to the greater benefic and to Chiron, has the potential to serve as a healing container by possibly activating intergenerational or collective wounds that need loving awareness and acknowledgement. Following the new moon in Libra, the sun ingresses Scorpio and Neptune retrogrades back into Pisces one last time on October 22nd. Neptune's last jaunt through Pisces will assist us in bringing closure to the last number of years of its tenure in the fishes as we transition into Neptune's passage through revolutionary Aries. Then on October 23rd, the waxing crescent moon will conjoin Mercury and Mars in the second decan of Scorpio, activating the Grand Water Trine that will peak in November. The final week of October sees Mercury's ingress into its fiery exile and immediate opposition to Uranus in Gemini retrograde, which may start to reflect some of the more jarring effects of the upcoming Mercury retrograde, especially around technology, media, and communications. These final transits in October lead us into the holy days of Samhain, Halloween, All Saints' Day, and the Day of the Dead. A reminder that we are supported by our benevolent ancestors and guardian spirits, noble daimonis, and chthonic deities. This concludes my overview of the month of October 2025. If you made it this far, make sure to hit the subscribe button, like and share my video with your friends. Leave me a comment with your reflections. I would love to know what you're looking forward to most this month or what stands out for you. And thank you for tuning in, and a special shout out to my supporters. Wishing you all a very safe and sacred October. Ciao until next time.